In the frozen darkness of a November night in 1811, the quiet lanes of Nottinghamshire trembled under a violence that no one had predicted. Hammers rose and fell with brutal precision, splintering the wooden frames of the new power looms into useless fragments while torches cast long, flickering shadows across the stone walls of workshops that had stood for generations. Masked figures moved like ghosts through the mist, their breath visible in the chill air, their voices low and urgent as they invoked the name of a long-dead rebel called Ned Ludd. The acrid smell of burning oil and charred timber hung heavy, mingling with the familiar scent of raw wool and machine grease. These were not rioters in the ordinary sense. They were skilled stockingers and weavers who had watched their livelihoods erode day by day, their hands, once the masters of intricate patterns, now rendered obsolete by iron and steam. The collapse did not announce itself with fanfare or proclamations. It crept in through the calculations of profit and the quiet turning of gears, destroying jobs long before any promise of new ones could take shape. By the time the first blows landed, the old order of craft and independence was already fracturing, yet no one truly understood what was coming next, the irreversible rupture that would dismantle centuries of human labor and replace it with a mechanical future few could imagine. The rhythmic clatter that had once filled every cottage and workshop fell silent that night, leaving only the echo of destruction and the faint, distant whistle of steam engines stirring to life on the horizon. England at the dawn of the 19th century stood on the brink of transformation, its countryside still dotted with the thatched roofs and stone walls of a world built on human hands rather than iron. The Napoleonic Wars had drained the nation's resources, leaving returning soldiers to compete for work in an economy already strained by rapid population growth and the enclosure of common lands that had once sustained small farmers. In the textile heartlands of the Midlands and the North, the domestic system of production had endured for centuries, weaving together family labor, local markets, and the quiet dignity of skilled trades. Rivers powered the occasional mill, but most cloth still emerged from cottages where men, women, and children worked side by side beneath the glow of tallow candles. The air carried the steady thump of hand looms and the soft murmur of conversation, while outside, smoke curled from chimneys and sheep grazed on the same hills that had fed generations. This was a society where skill defined status, where a master weaver could command respect and a decent wage, and where the pace of life followed the seasons and the demands of the shuttle, rather than the relentless tick of the factory clock. Yet beneath this surface of continuity, invisible forces were gathering, pressures that would soon tear the fabric of daily existence apart with a speed and finality that no petition or protest could halt. Life before the machines had a texture and rhythm that felt eternal to those who lived it. Dawn broke with the creak of floorboards as families rose to the familiar scent of porridge and damp wool. Children learned the trade at their parents' knees, their small fingers guiding the shuttle while elders sang ballads passed down through generations. The workshop was the heart of the home, its walls lined with neatly arranged tools and skeins of yarn, dyed in soft vegetable hues. Meals were taken together at midday, stories exchanged over the clack and thump of the loom, and evenings brought the glow of hearth fires where repairs were made and plans for market day were laid. Pride ran deep. A well-woven piece of broadcloth could fetch a price that fed the household for weeks, and the weaver's calloused hands were badges of honor rather than marks of poverty. Sundays meant church bells and village greens where neighbors gathered, exchanging news of distant wars and local harvests. There was hardship, of course bad harvests brought lean times, but the system allowed a measure of autonomy that factories would never replicate. The collapse, when it came, would not simply take away income, it would strip away the very structure of these intimate, self-directed lives, leaving silence where once there had been the steady heartbeat of human craft. The early warning signs arrived so gradually that many dismissed them as temporary inconveniences rather than the first tremors of systemic failure. In the late 18th century, inventors like James Hargreaves with his spinning jenny and Richard Arkwright with his water frame had begun to mechanize parts of the textile process, promising faster production and lower costs. Edmund Cartwright's power loom, patented in 1785, sat largely idle at first, its wooden mechanisms prone to breakdown and its output still inferior to the skilled hand weaver. Mill owners experimented cautiously, installing a few machines in isolated sheds while the majority of cloth continued to flow from cottage looms. Petitions reached Parliament, warning of unfair competition, yet the response was muted, buried beneath debates over war and empire. The air in the workshops still hummed with human effort, but occasionally a new sound intruded, The distant clank of experimental frames carried on the wind from distant valleys. Workers spoke of these contraptions in hushed tones around tavern fires, some laughing them off as novelties, others sensing an unease they could not name. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly in the ledgers of ambitious entrepreneurs and the patents filed in dusty offices, where the logic of efficiency slowly eroded the value of human skill. By the time the signs became clear, the old equilibrium had already begun to shift, and the machines waited patiently for their moment to dominate. Tension rose like a slow flood, invisible at first but steadily swallowing the ground beneath the old way of life. As factories multiplied along the rivers of Lancashire and Yorkshire, they produced cloth at prices no hand weaver could match, flooding markets and driving down wages even for those still working at home. Unskilled laborers, often women and children, tended the new machines for pennies a day, their repetitive tasks requiring neither the years of apprenticeship nor the pride that once defined the trade. Master weavers watched their orders dwindle, their carefully negotiated piece rates slashed by merchants who now held the power. Families tightened belts, sold heirloom tools, and sent children to the factories earlier each year. In the evenings, conversations grew sharper, laced with resentment toward the steam-powered monsters that never tired, never demanded fair pay, and never paused for rest. The air in the villages thickened with unspoken fear. Neighbors who once shared tools now competed for the dwindling scraps of work. The system that had sustained communities for centuries was cracking under the pressure of relentless innovation, yet the authorities saw only profit and progress. Key decisions were being made in counting houses and parliamentary chambers, decisions that favored the machine over the man, the investor over the artisan, and no one paused long enough to consider the human cost that would soon spill into open revolt. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single cataclysm, but with a wave of coordinated defiance that spread like fire across the industrial districts. In March 1811, the first organized attack struck in the lace and stocking districts of Nottingham, where bands of Luddites swore solemn oaths by candlelight and marched under cover of darkness to destroy the frames that threatened their survival. Word traveled along hidden networks of messengers and sympathetic innkeepers, carrying the call to Yorkshire and Lancashire. Mill owners barricaded their premises, but the attackers moved with precision born of desperation, smashing only the offending machines while sparing the buildings themselves. The government responded with fury, rushing troops northward and rushing the Frame Breaking Act through Parliament in 1812, making machine destruction a capital crime. Yet the resistance only hardened. Petitions were ignored, wages continued to fall, and the machines kept multiplying. The collapse had crossed a threshold from quiet erosion to open rupture, and the human response, raw, furious, and ultimately doomed, revealed how deeply the old world had already been hollowed out. By the time the full scale of the crackdown became clear, the weaver's world was fracturing beyond repair, its fragments scattered across courtrooms, prisons, and the growing slums of the new industrial towns. Human consequences unfolded with brutal clarity as the machines claimed their territory and the old trades withered. Unemployment surged in the textile districts. Families that had once eaten regularly now queued at parish relief offices or scavenged for scraps in the fields. Children who should have been learning the loom now labored in factories from dawn until dusk, their bodies stunted and their spirits broken. The proud independence of the cottage weaver gave way to the humiliation of the workhouse or the dangerous migration to the city, where overcrowded tenements bred disease and despair. Hunger became a constant companion. Bread riots erupted in market squares while soldiers stood watch over the very machines that had caused the scarcity. Mothers watched their husbands leave home at night and return silent and defeated, or worse, not return at all after clashes with troops. The social fabric that had bound villages together for centuries began to fray. Neighbor turned against neighbor in the scramble for the few remaining jobs, trust evaporated, and fear settled into the bones of every household. The collapse was no longer abstract. It was measured in empty bellies, shuttered workshops, and the growing number of funerals for those who could no longer endure the slow suffocation of their former lives. Social breakdown accelerated as the authorities tightened their grip, and the Luddites' desperate campaign reached its violent climax. Secret meetings in remote barns and moorland hollows replaced open conversation. Oaths of loyalty were sworn in whispers while government spies infiltrated the ranks. In April 1812, a mill owner was assassinated near Huddersfield, an act that shocked the nation and justified even harsher repression. Trials in York in 1813 saw 17 men hanged in a single morning, their bodies left dangling as grim warnings while crowds of silent onlookers watched from the streets below. Families were torn apart by transportation to Australia or long prison sentences. Entire communities lived under martial law, their daily routines shadowed by the tramp of soldiers' boots and the constant threat of betrayal. The once vibrant culture of craft and mutual aid dissolved into suspicion and survival. The machines had not only destroyed jobs, they had shattered the social bonds that had sustained generations, leaving a vacuum that the new factory system would fill with its own harsh discipline. By the time the last Luddite actions faded in 1816, the old world lay in ruins, its survivors forced to adapt or perish in the shadow of the very technology that had displaced them. The long-term historical impact revealed itself slowly but inexorably as the machines triumphed and a new industrial order rose from the wreckage. Factories multiplied across the north, drawing rural populations into sprawling cities where steam and smoke became the new skyline. The displaced weavers and their descendants found work not as independent artisans but as machine minders and operatives, their labor now measured in shifts and output quotas rather than skill and pride. New trades emerged: engineers to build the looms, mechanics to maintain them, clerks to manage the expanding ledgers, yet these opportunities arrived only after years of widespread poverty and dislocation. The domestic system vanished almost entirely, replaced by a centralized, capital-driven economy that powered Britain's global dominance, but at the cost of profound social upheaval. Urbanization accelerated, railways followed, and the very concept of work transformed from a craft, passed through families to a commodity bought and sold in the marketplace. The collapse of the artisanal world had been painful and irreversible, yet it also cleared the ground for the modern industrial society that would define the next 2 centuries, proving once again that machines destroy before they create, reshaping civilization in ways that no one standing amid the broken frames in 1811 could have foreseen. The echoes of those hammers in the Nottingham night have never truly faded. They linger in the quiet moments when new technologies appear on the horizon, promising efficiency while quietly dismantling the familiar rhythms of human labor. The Luddites fought not against progress itself, but against the immediate ruin it inflicted on their families, their communities, and their sense of worth. Their defeat marked the beginning of a recurring pattern, in which each wave of mechanization first destroys the old before birthing the new, leaving behind generations who must navigate the gap between loss and adaptation. Villages that once hummed with the sound of handlooms now stand as relics beside the ruins of mills that themselves became obsolete in later eras. The collapse was never a single event but a process that unfolded across decades, its human cost measured in silenced looms and broken lives, its legacy written into the very structure of the modern world. In the end, the machines prevailed, and the world moved forward, yet the question they left behind remains suspended in the air, like the smoke from those long extinguished torches. When the next wave arrives, who will stand in its path, and what will be left when the gears finally stop turning? The story of those who lost their world to iron and steam is not merely history. It is the quiet warning carried forward through time, a reminder that every technological dawn casts its own long and uncertain shadow.